Hey, good morning. That was awesome. Today we're starting a new series called Different, a study of the life of Daniel. Daniel is a character we read about in the Old Testament. To say he's a character would be an understatement. He was a person, a real person in history. And his life was impacted in such an amazing way by God to develop him as his character and who he was. But his life was also impacted so much by history of what was going on around him, and how he navigated that is more than just inspiring. Sometimes, especially if you grew up in church, we hear stories of people like Daniel and we think they're role models, or they're there to inspire us. And really, Daniel is not the star of Daniel's story. Daniel is not the center of Daniel's story. God is the center of Daniel's story. And that's why, because God was the center of Daniel's life, he lived different. If you're familiar with the story of Daniel, beware, because you might miss something new or be reminded of something that you need to hear again. But Daniel's story, it starts 600 years before the birth of Christ, and it doesn't start well. Daniel was a teenager. If you're 11, 12, 13, 14, somewhere in that age, that's how old Daniel was when this thing starts. And one day, Daniel wakes up in Jerusalem, looks out, and suddenly his city, Jerusalem, where he was growing up, is surrounded, and it's pretty obvious they're not going to win. They're going to lose. Everything that Daniel knew was about to be different. Everything he had planned was about to be different. Everything he had hoped for was about to be different. And when something takes a turn like that for us, when I expect one thing and I experience another, when I am, have high hopes and suddenly the bottom falls out, how we respond in that moment is important. But actually, what the lesson from Daniel's life we're going to talk about this week, it wasn't how you respond in the moment, it's how you prepare ahead of time. In Daniel's story, it's found in the book of Daniel. He's in the prophets kind of section of the Old Testament. But it's very different than any other book like that around there. It's very organized how it's laid out. It's got a lot of narrative. It's also, as well as got a lot of pictures and prophetic literature in it. But in Daniel 2, chapter 1, it picks up, and it's 605 BC. That's lost on us. So just think 600 years before Jesus was born. The Egyptians were the world power that were overthrown by the Assyrians. Now the Assyrians have been overthrown by the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar is the field commander of the army. His dad is king, and he's about to be king. And he was a bad dude. They had just taken over a lot of land. And on their way back from their road trip back home, they cruise past Jerusalem and think, hey, let's overthrow that city too. And that's where it picks up. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That means he surrounded it, sealed it off, nothing's getting in or out, and it's basically a death grip until they tap out. They tapped out. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. It's an interesting thing. The Lord did it. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar that's forcing God's hand. Actually, God is guiding Nebuchadnezzar's hand. He takes Jerusalem along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. 23 years before this story, actually you can go back even 200 years, and you read prophets like Jeremiah and Habakkuk. They knew this day was coming. God had said, I've given you chance after chance after chance, and you keep turning away. It's in your best interest to stick close to me, but you keep wandering away. So a day's coming, and God calls it exactly how it went down, as much as 25 to even 200 years beforehand, saying, this is what's going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. You can also read about this in 2 Kings 24. And God allows this to happen. What could have been lost by Daniel was the fact that God is right in the middle of this story. Because when the bottom falls out, when things are going bad, we tend to think God has turned his back, or he doesn't care, or he's just punishing for the sake of punishment. No, he's trying to refine them and bring them back. But also what he's doing is he's sending these people out to be an example to the world. I don't know what's going on in your story right now, but if it's not going well from your perspective, you need to know that God's right in the middle of that, and he is active and at work. They carried off some treasures, trophies, the stuff that they used as instruments and articles of worship, and they carried off to be in their trophy case to kind of degrade them and to kind of throw them off balance. But they didn't just carry off stuff, they carried off people. Verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, that's a pretty cool name, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. They didn't just take stuff from Jerusalem. They took people. Daniel had a family, and he's carried off hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelites were carried off as trophies and spoils of war. Everything in their life was different from this point on. Daniel's a teenager. He's got hopes for dating, for marriage, for career, for family. And it's all gone. And suddenly he's in a different place, in a different school, with different values. You see some of the values of Babylon. What they cared about was, we want young and handsome and smart. That's what they valued. This was done to kind of punish them, to kind of take hostages. But also what they wanted to do is find the very best from Jerusalem's team and bring them onto the Babylonian team and have them serve in their empire. And eventually they would send them back, but they would come back with different values and different gods and different beliefs. And they would send back, and then they would influence Jerusalem. It was a very sophisticated strategy. But they didn't plan on Daniel and his friends to say, you may be different, but we're different too. Daniel suddenly finds that he's received a scholarship to Babylon University instead of Jerusalem Tech. He was hoping to go there, but instead he's enrolled in this Babylon University. Verse 4, it says this. The chief official was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. This isn't just like cursive and writing. This isn't just a new language. This was a new belief system and a new value system. Then it says the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. That was not on Daniel's career path. But he receives this scholarship, and the goal is to shape their values and shape even their identity. And for 3 years, they said, we're going to train you. We're going to transform you to be like us, to think like us, to talk like us, to believe like us, to choose like us. You're going to be like us. That happens to us all the time. We're not overthrown. We don't have a foreign leader that's coming in and saying, I'm going to force you to do something different with your education. But we have all the time something or someone around us that's trying to shape us. There will always be efforts made to shape your image and your values, your identity. It's always happening by the world. It's also always happening by God. God is always trying to shape your identity, your values, and your beliefs to help you be the person he created you to be and live for the purposes he's created for your life to have. Their goal was that they wanted them to think like they think, talk like they talk, look like they look, date like they date, spend like they spend, believe like they believe. That happens to us all the time too. And if you're not constantly asking the question, who or what is shaping my life, you are being shaped and you don't even know it by something or someone. And eventually you're going to look up and go, what happened? Or even worse, you were not even aware it happened, and you roll on your story and suddenly it's writing a different story. This is how they tried to change Daniel's identity, one of the ways. Among those who were chosen from Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. Daniel, he gave the name Belshazzar. Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. It's lost on us how significant this is. Every one of their names was tied to their relationship with God. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. God is in charge. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, we're going to give you a new name. And they don't just, they change it so much that suddenly it's not about their God, it's about the moon god. And it even changes the gender of his name. They're changing everything about how he thinks of himself, or at least they're trying to. Suddenly, it's not about you and your God, it's about you and our God. And what were Daniel's three friends' names? Don't look at the screen. You remember their names? Isn't it interesting that we remember their Babylonian names, not their Hebrew names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We remember the names that were changed. Maybe it's easier to say or funner to say. I don't know. But the whole point of changing their names was to change their identity. But it didn't work. Daniel's future was different than he thought it was going to be. But he didn't let what was different around him shape him. What he said is, call me what you want, but I know who I am and I know whose I am. And he lived differently, so much so, and this is a key verse for chapter 1. Daniel 1 verse 8, it says this, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Daniel had this system of saying, no, there's something about this that would defile me. It would shape me in a way that it's not good. Another translation says, Daniel purposed in his heart. Basically what they said is, we may be in your kingdom, but we will not be part of your kingdom. Your kingdom will not be the defining force of my life. They resolved to be different. And here's what you need to know. This is what Daniel got right. God defines your difference. A lot of times I feel like I'm holding the pen doing that I define my difference. But what Daniel said was very smart. He told a very intimidating leader and ruler, you do not define me. But at the same time, he says, I do not define me. God's in charge. That's what his name meant. God is in charge. And he said, just because you're the king and I'm in your kingdom, doesn't mean you're my king. He resolved, but here's the other thing that's interesting. He asked for permission. He's resolved and he takes a stand, but he's not a jerk. Don't let that be lost on you, how effective Daniel was, is he found a way to balance this tension by doing what's right, but doing it in the right way. Of saying God's in charge, but at the same time, I believe God asked me to submit to those who are in charge. He handled it. We'll spend a lot more time on that next week. It's amazing how he navigates this. Because Nebuchadnezzar is the type that's known to give people the axe, literally. There was one guy you read about, where was that? I think it was in Jeremiah, where he's taking a guy and he's punishing him, and he gouges his eyes out. Didn't kill him. He just wants his last images to be so disturbing. But that's the last thing he sees, and he gouges his eye out. Terrible guy. And Daniel takes a stand. He resolved, but he did it in a respectful way. The key here is this wasn't an in the moment where he just said, you know what? I don't feel like eating that. He knew ahead of time who he was. He knew ahead of time what his values were. He knew ahead of time what his beliefs were. He knew ahead of time what his boundaries or guardrails were. And he said, those are things I'm not okay with. The key is advanced decision making. I remember one time it impacted me and it served me well, and I'm so glad I had done this. Jennifer and I had just been married, and we were living in our first apartment. I think it was our only apartment. We lived in this apartment. That's not important to the story. We're living in this apartment. Our upstairs neighbor was a nice guy, and he was getting married. He invited me to be part of his wedding by going to the bachelor party. And he said, hey, we're going to a strip club. And I said, you know what? I appreciate that, but I can't go with you. He said, why? You don't have to do anything. Just hang out with us. You can face the other way. I was like, no. It's like just being in that environment. I know myself, I'd probably be tempted not to just look the other way. But he said, well, what's the big deal? You're not doing anything. You're just looking. I said, yeah, but I'm looking at a person as an object. And I just can't do that. I'm not going to tell you not to do it, but I'm just saying that's why I can't. I already decided ahead of time, there are some things I can't look at without I know it would affect me looking as a woman becoming an object. I said, I can't do it. And in that case, it went really well. He was very respectful of me. We had some awkward conversations after that. I was a little embarrassed, I'll be honest. But I had decided ahead of time what I would and wouldn't do. You know, some of us, we do that with our having a budget. So when we get in the moment, we don't look at something and go, hey, I think I'm going to buy this. We decide ahead of time, no, I've only set aside a certain amount of money to spend on that. And because I want to have money left at the end of the month, which is not the normal way of living, which is why a lot of us are in the problems we're in, I decide ahead of time, I'm not going to buy certain things. You may have done this with your health. If you've had medical issues or if you just want to live healthier, you decide ahead of time, hey, when that, you know, even as hard as it is, this may even feel sacrilegious as a Texan, I'm not going to have the chips and salsa. Wow. Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Like, man, sometimes with your health, you go, man, I know it's bad to eat chips. I'm not going to have the chips and salsa. I may have lost some of you on that one. I get that. Advanced decision-making is key. If you wait until the moment to make the decision, you're not going to make a good decision. And I could tell you stories about my life that I did not decide ahead of time, and the choices did not go well. To this day, it bothers me because I can't rewrite my history. God can. And I know I'm forgiven and free. And God wants me to drop my baggage, but sometimes those mistakes, it's hard. And almost every single one I could trace back to saying, I didn't decide in advance who or whose I am. I just kind of went with the gut. So how do you know what the resolve is? Isn't it weird that his resolve was about food? He doesn't put his foot down and say, no, I'm not going to leave my home. He doesn't say, no, you won't call me, change my name from Daniel, God's in charge, to lover of the moon god. He puts his foot down at food. Why was it food? Well, I think there's two reasons. One, they viewed food coming from the king's table, which was really good stuff. They viewed that as being sacrilegious because it was offered to idols. It was part of their worship of other gods. I think the other thing is this. I think he knew this might be a battle he could win. But I think also he knew this is a chance to stand out and be different as many as 3 times a day, every time food was served. He's in the cafeteria, and suddenly he's getting the veggie plate. He's getting something different. And if you take a stand, sometimes you will stand out and it will be uncomfortable. But he resolved to do that. So how do I know what my resolve should be? How do I know what I need to say? But Doug resolved not to, or to always. Like, what is that for me? What is that for you? Well, for me, I can tell you how I think about it. I tell you this is how I think really everybody should think about it. This isn't original with me. But for me, my resolve is to follow Jesus and to do his plan, to follow his will. And I can tell you the number one question I get asked as a pastor is, I don't know God's will for my life in this, and it usually comes back to who I'm dating, who I'm marrying, where I'm living, where I'm working, where I'm going to school. It's usually some of those kind of categories. I don't know God's plan for my life. What I always say is, well, we can know a lot of God's plans for his life. Paul Little said 90% of God's plan is found in here. The problem is I'm really focused more on the other part. And my chances of making a good decision about the 10% about where I live, who I date, who I marry, who my friends are, where I go to school, where I work, all that kind of stuff, is increasingly better off if I focus on that other 90%. And what I usually try to point people to is there are 5 things literally where God tells us, this is my plan for your life. So if I want to resolve to do anything, I resolve to follow Jesus, to let him be in charge, and to do what he has planned, to do his will. Here are the 5 things we know that God says, this is your plan for your life. So it's here. Follow Jesus, be filled with the Holy Spirit, be thankful, abstain from sexual immorality, and submit to authorities. And from everything we see in Daniel's story, he did that. He followed God's leadership. He relied on God's power. You can tell from some of his prayers that he was thankful. There's a theory, it's a speculation, that Daniel was castrated when he was taken into service. Abstaining from sexual immorality was not really an issue. Like, that was taken off the table. It's not sure. He was put in charge with the eunuchs, and so it's hard to know if that's what happened or not. But that was their track record. If you're coming into our country, we want to not have you procreate. And Egypt, that did not go well for them with their slaves. And so Nebuchadnezzar took a lesson from that. But these are the things, submitting to authorities. How did Daniel handle this situation? But again, back to my resolve. If I'm going to resolve to follow Jesus and follow God's plan, I know it tells me in those verses, this is God's plan for our life. So if you're trying to figure out who your friends should be, who you should date, who you should marry, where you should work, where you should live, what you should do, before you make those decisions, start with these. Because he says very clearly that's what this is. And in verse 1:8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with what he ate. What is your resolve? What are the things where you decide in advance? You know, that question for me that came up about the strip club, it's because one of my core values was people matter to God. And if it causes me to look at someone and devalue them, I can't do it. That happens in every area of life. You can be tempted to devalue people. But that core value has served me well. And that was my resolve, and it served me well in that moment. What are your resolves? If you do not define ahead of time, when you get in the moment, the decision's already made. Decide ahead of time so there's no decision to be made in the moment. Choose to be different. The question is, are you letting Jesus define your difference? With your thought life, with your social media, with your words, with your relationships, with your sexuality, with your words, with your friends, with your money. God defines it. And then we resolve to live that way. And the thing is, God defines it. And you've got to figure out, what is your resolve? It can't be done in the moment. But God just doesn't define it. He empowers it. Look at verse 9. It says this. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. God empowered the difference. Daniel, and some of it has to do with Daniel's approach. He's respectful. And the guy has compassion. But it wasn't just Daniel's approach. God is right in the middle of his story, and he empowers him to do something by giving favor and compassion to this guy who's in charge and the decision maker. Goes on to say this. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid that the Lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink, why should he be looking any worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Like, that was a real thing. That was in their policies and procedures. Like, people died on a regular basis if they failed at their assignments. Like, he was not just, like, exaggerating. Like, if this doesn't go well, I'm dead. So Daniel said this. So before your quarterly review, before your whatever comes up, before your one-on-one with your boss, it says this in verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days. Just give us 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. My biggest issue with the Daniel story is, man, I really like steak and potatoes. Like, I'm questioning, like, really, you're going with the veggie plate? But that's fine. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. With what people see in your life, do they see a difference? Not just in a difference in your choices, but if God is empowering your difference, it will draw attention to him, not you. is your difference? What is your resolve? And if God defines it, he's going to empower it, and you will see something different. Basically, he says, watch our lives and see for yourself. So the question is, do people see your difference? So the guy agrees. 10 days pass, and they looked healthier than everybody else. Like it wasn't like, I can't really tell. Like somehow in 10 days, there was a big difference. God defined their difference. He empowered it, and it's obvious to see. To these young, and then it gives this little kind of comment. To these 4 young men, that's Daniel and his 3 friends, God empowers their difference. God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. They didn't just enroll in Babylon U, but they're like, we're not going to learn your stuff. They learned it and they excelled. Like they were dean's list. They were doing well. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And that becomes a key part of his story of how he gets the ear of not just one king, but multiple kings. God empowered his difference. He'll empower our difference too. Then God defined their difference and made a difference. They stood out at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service. So now it's game time. Nebuchadnezzar's going to look at these guys who've enrolled in Babylon University, transfer students, redshirt, grad transfers from Jerusalem Tech. Like suddenly they're in Babylon. They're there, and he's going to look at his guys, and these guys stand out. The chief official presents them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their different made a difference, and God will use your difference. You will be different. He found none equal. God uses your difference to make a difference, and it'll stand out. What would be awesome at this point is if it read this way. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they stood out. There was none equal. So the king let them go home. No. So they entered the king's service. Hey, you passed. You're the best. You're different. We even may think it has something to do with your God. So can we go home? No. No, you're going to stay here. In fact, Daniel was there for a long time. The very next verse almost seems like a throwaway, but it's not. Verse 21, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's almost 70 years. Daniel would get into his 80s. He passes this test, not just by living, but by honoring God and standing out and pointing people to his God. And there's something about that. But he doesn't get to go home. He stays there for a long time. 70 years, as many as maybe 7 kings. He served directly with 4. 2 different kingdoms. The Babylonians would lose power. And the next people would come in. But Daniel's still there. People will come and go. Things will come and go. Times will come and go. Seasons will change. But the lesson from Daniel's life is not Daniel's courage. And if that's what we learned when we learned these when we were little, we're missing the point. The centerpiece of Daniel's story, of this whole story that he tells us from the very beginning to the very end, is God's in charge. God is in charge. And when Daniel recognized that, it defined his difference, it empowered his difference, and he used him to make a difference. That is the main point of Daniel. God is sovereign. God is in charge. No matter what your eyes may see, God is in charge. God is consistent. And he's consistently reliable. Daniel and his 3 friends, we know their names. We don't know the names of really any of these other captives at this point. There could have been as many as 10,000. There were hundreds, if not thousands, that were taken. We don't know any of the other names. I don't know if they were eating the steak and at the king's table or saying, well, we're not with you. We just don't have record of them. But chances are that Daniel and his friends stood out because they chose to be different. God had defined their difference, and that advanced decision-making meant in the moment there was no decision to be made. God's in charge, and I know no matter what it costs me, here's what I've got to do. What we'll look at next week is, but how I do that, I'll be respectful of people. It really matters. God empowered their difference. He was with them, very much like Joseph's story in the Old Testament. God is right in the middle of this, and their difference is used by God, and your difference will make a difference. And when you choose to blend in and not stand out, you're missing an opportunity that I think God has planned for you. My hope is that as we look at Daniel's life, we'll be different. Not just following his example of courage, but knowing that God is in charge, and he defines my difference. There's some resources for you in this series. You can go through the Live Oak app or website. There's discussion questions. A lot of our small groups are using those. Most of our small groups are using those as we're discussing the messages. There's a message recap video, a brief summary of the message for each week, as well as a memory verse lock screen. We also have a reading plan under reading plans that's unique for Daniel, just like always. You can find those there. And we're going to do a memory verse each week. Because here's what I learned. My son is running cross country right now, and I told him, I said, here's what I've learned about athletes. Not because I am one or was one, but because I've been around athletes, and I've learned this. What you put in your mouth, in terms of water, food, diet, stuff like that, what you put in your head in terms of images, thoughts, words, the effort you put in, and the preparation you put in, all those things you put in makes a difference in what comes out. That's not just for athletes. What you're putting in your head this week, I would encourage you to resolve to guard your heart, to guard your mind. And one of the best ways to do that is to put God's truth in your mind. And this is the verse we looked at. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. I want to challenge you to memorize that this week. You can actually also go and make it a lock screen where, if I didn't have all those text messages, I would be able to show you. Golly, I don't know how to clear those out. If I could show you my lock screen, oh, there we go. I've got on there. So every time I look at my lock screen, I can help memorize this truth. But there's no test next week. I'll ask if you know it. I'll say it out loud by memory and see who can join me. The test is every time you're put in a situation where you have the opportunity to be different than what God has called you to do. To live out of a different identity than God who he's called you to be. To make a choice that's different than you know what God has planned for you. Then you know what's best for your future and the future of others. Anytime you choose to be different that's not defined by God, be very careful. The days are evil. You do need to be wise and not unwise. You do need to be careful how you live. Make a resolve to understand and live out what the Lord's will is. Resolve to be different. And I would encourage you, before you your head hits the pillow tonight, could you jot down a few things to say, these are my resolves about who I am, whose I am, and how I'm going to live. Advanced decision making is key. But this has a lot more to do with our identity and knowing that he's in charge. Not just of the world, he's in charge of my world. Daniel knew that, and he stood because of it. Let's stand for closing prayer. Actually, no, stay seated. I'm sorry, stay seated. I would like, if you're a small group leader, if you lead a small group for adults or college students at Live Oak, would you stand? If you're a small group leader, thank you. If you're a small group leader, would you stand? Okay, these are adult small group leaders. Or if you're an E2, a coach of small group leaders, would you stand? If you do that with college ministry, student ministry, or kids ministry, keep standing if you're already standing, and you're a small group leader, sisters and seekers, anything like that, kids ministry, student ministry, if you're a small group leader. Small group leaders are the lifeblood of Live Oak. They can help know you and help you know your next step. They help create circles where community happens. And so we want to close our service for praying for them as they stand with us and help people be known, give careful attention to, cared for, and know their next step and shepherded. Would you join me in praying for these small group leaders and others that aren't here at Live Oak? Would you do that with me? All right, now that you see them, everybody stand and let's pray for our small group leaders. God, thanks for this very, very special group of people, of leaders and coaches at Live Oak that are committed to helping people be known, to help people be cared for, to help people know their next step. And I pray your best and blessings on them, not just in their effectiveness of what they do. We really want that because it's key to our mission. But I also pray for your best and blessings for them in their life, that their life would be an overflow of you pouring into their life, of knowing that they're loved, cared for, equipped, and empowered, and that their difference would make a difference in the groups that they lead. God, thank you for community and creating us to do life together and not do life alone. Thanks that one of the keys to Daniel's story is he had some friends with him that had to make it easier. God, thanks that you are committed, and so it's time and time again that community relationships matter. And I pray your best and blessings, not just on these small group leaders, but on the groups and the people they represent. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey, thanks for being here. If you'd like to talk, I'll be down at the front.